Thank you all for joining us today for this Cultivating Success Small Farms Education webinar on vermicomposting. We're really excited about this topic and about offering these webinars through the Cultivating Success program. Cultivating Success was established in 2000 by University of Idaho Extension, Washington State Food Systems Program, and the nonprofit organization Rural Roots. This is our fourth year of offering our webinar series. Just a couple of quick tips. I know that you're probably all pretty familiar with Zoom or being online, but if at any time you're experiencing some speed issues with sound or advancing of slides during the presentation, you can type into the chat, and Mackenzie and I will be standing by to provide technical assistance. You can also close the programs that are running on your computer, and you can switch to the phone at any time. A call-in number is in your welcome email. If you do switch to the phone, it's going to be important to mute your computer so you don't get feedback. During the presentation today, we hope that you will type questions in as they come to you in the Q&A box. So if you look in your control bar, which is generally at the bottom of your screen, you'll see that there is both a Q&A box and a chat box. We'd appreciate it if you could try to put your questions into the Q&A box. At any time, you can chat with participants through the chat box. We will pause periodically through the presentation to answer any questions that have come in. This webinar is being recorded, and a slide handout will be available on the Cultivating Success website, along with a publication on vermiculture. Oops. So today's presenter is Nick Usabel he's a University of Idaho Extension. Nick is a horticulture educator located in Canyon County, and we're really excited to have you here today, Nick, and I want to turn over the presentation to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Colette. And it's great to be here this afternoon where I'm at, or this morning where others may be, to talk to you today about vermicomposting and vermiculture a little bit in general. So I am located in Canyon County in Caldwell, Idaho, and focus on horticulture and work with the master gardeners here in Canyon County. So just a little bit of an outline today as we get started with our vermiculture and vermicomposting. So we'll touch base just a little bit about both of those. We'll talk a little on worm biology, because it's always nice to know a little bit about the new friends that you're going to be making in your vermiculture bin. We'll look at bin construction, and then how to maintain and harvest that bin as that time arises when you get to harvesting. And then we'll end today with a little bit of information on troubleshooting. So, should you start your bin? What are some things that I might expect as potential problems, or if you currently have a bin, kind of be able to look at what's happening in your bin and hopefully be able to troubleshoot those and solve those today as we move through our program. So with that, we're going to kind of move into our first slide here, why do individuals choose to complete vermicomposting, or why do we vermicompost? The main piece really comes is that you're trying to create this nutritious soil amendment, and we're really kind of boosting nutrients that are available to the plant, and we're really trying to enhance that soil structure and drainage if we think about the overall idea of compost in general, and to be able to add that to our garden space or containers or indoor house plants. But when we're looking at vermicomposting, we really are using the food scraps that are located within our household that we're using. So as we, peel that cucumber, or we have additional apple components that we maybe didn't use, or perhaps blueberries that didn't last as long as we thought they would, we're able to use those food scraps and really turn those into a nutritious soil amendment. A lot of times, individuals who maybe don't have a lot of space to compost outside will use vermicomposting inside, because it really does require very little space. Doesn't require a lot of labor or maintenance. In fact, we have a vermiculture bin here in our office, and I will admit I'm not the best caretaker of our friends here in the office for our vermiculture bin, but they do just fine as we continue to feed them throughout the year. So not a lot of maintenance and labor in that regard. And it's something that you can do indoors year round. So most of our areas within Idaho and surrounding, outdoors is not necessarily a great suitable location to house our vermiculture bins, but we will kind of talk about that and mention those components as we dig a little bit deeper into our presentation today to look at some of those conditions, those environmental conditions. And perhaps you are joining us from a location where you could have those or house those outdoors. That would be a location that you could, if environmental conditions allow you to do so. And when we think about using this indoors, our well-maintained vermiculture bin will not produce an odor. And so we don't have to worry about odors that may be produced inside. So that's another great thing about these vermiculture bins is we can compost inside and don't have to worry about that odor. And it really will reduce the waste that's sent to our garbage or our landfill locations. Although, as one individual person, it may not be a lot of waste out of your specific household. But if we had a number of individuals who are practicing vermiculture and vermicomposting, we would be able to reduce that waste. And we could say that there's a little bit of savings in terms of the amount of water that you might use or electricity. And this really comes from that use of the garbage disposal in your kitchen sink. So if you are an individual who's maybe using that garbage disposal and you can take these food waste scraps and use them in a vermiculture bin, you would be saving a little bit of money on water and electricity that would be used to operate that garbage disposal. And then, in general, who wouldn't want to have some nice little worm friends that are sitting inside your bin and to be able to change those table scraps into a nutrient dense compound as compost that you can use. So we've got a little bit in terms of why do individuals like to compost or why would we consider that? Now let's talk a touch about vermiculture and vermicomposting in general. So the first thing to think about is vermiculture. So vermiculture really says that we are just going to be raising worms. So vermiculture, in this case, we're going to be talking about our red wigglers. So our vermiculture bin is really going to be raising that particular type of worm. When we start to look at, other ways to raise worms and different types of worms, this idea of vermiculture is the same, but we're raising worms in this case. And so now we're going to create this vermicompost or vermicomposting. And that just simply says that we're going to make this black gold or this compost for or with our worms. And so as we look at traditional microbial composting, over on the left, we've got our carbon and we've got our nitrogen. So we've created this traditional pile. And so this is our traditional compost pile that, you may have currently in your backyard. You may have a large compost pile that you're working on, but we take that carbon to nitrogen ratio with our greens and our browns and adding that water, perhaps maintaining that temperature depending on how much of a composter you like to get into and delve into that area of compost. But we have to have oxygen in order for that compost to be created. So we have to turn that pile. And then that compost pile releases heat and carbon dioxide, and we end up with our compost that's created. So if we take this idea of this microbial composting on this particular picture and we compare it to the next one, which is going to be our vermicompost. We still have our carbon and nitrogen. These are going to be our food scraps that we'll find in the kitchen. Perhaps it's those cucumber peels, maybe potato peels, celery that went bad that we can use in that particular vermiculture bin. Our worms are living creatures, so they still do need oxygen in order to continue this vermiculture process or vermicomposting. And then during that process, they're reducing CO2. So the thing that was missing between these two, if we're comparing them, really is that idea of heat. So our vermiculture bin does not produce that heat because our worms are not going to enjoy those temperatures that a traditional composting bin or composting pile would create. So we're missing the heat. We're still reducing or releasing that carbon dioxide as these worms do their job and break down that compost. If we compare these two composts, there is potential for a vermiculture bin to have up to 4% more nitrogen in that final compost product. Now that nitrogen obviously would relate to what products are you placing into that bin. So that's just a general overall idea in terms of that final nitrogen percentage. But overall, generally that compost in a vermiculture bin would be slightly higher in nitrogen. And we generally have a lower carbon to nitrogen ratio as we look at that. So when we think about that one missing component that was in our traditional compost, which was heat, keep in mind that if you have plenty of heat in a traditional compost pile, it helps to sterilize some of those seeds that you may have added to that pile. So perhaps you placed out some cucumbers or you had some pumpkins that maybe you were done with at the end of the season for decoration. But those seeds in a vermiculture bin will not be sterilized, and our worms are not going to eat through and essentially kill that seed. So as you look at vermiculture and you use this compost, you're going to find that seeds will still be in there. Now you could sift that compost and pull those seeds out, but do know that if you're just using this compost and you have seeds in there, don't be surprised if you get some little seeds or seedlings that start to germinate and sprout as you place that into, potentially a houseplant inside, a container outside, or into your garden space. So one of the things that is different between the two, and I like to kind of give that information ahead of time so that you can definitely add seeds. We add them here in the office. Sometimes they germinate in that vermiculture bin, and other times we find that they germinate when we use that compost in various pots, containers, and so forth. So next we get to kind of the combination of what do we have in order to create vermicomposting. And so this picture really shows the process of what we're doing and what we end up at the end. So we have our friends, our little red wigglers here in the top left picture. And in that vermiculture bin, we're going to add our kitchen food scraps. And so you can see a number of food scraps in here that would be okay to use in that particular vermiculture bin. There are a few things that we will discuss that are not friendly to our worm friends. And so we would not want to put those in the bin. And then in the end, you get this nice, dark, rich compost that is created from that process of those worms eating through this compost and creating that worm cast and so forth. So that's our end product and our end goal that we hope to kind of create and produce. And it almost looks like kind of like a crumbly chocolate cake in a way, kind of a dark chocolate cake, but that's what we would end up with at the end when we get this nice compost. So let's dig a little bit into our worm biology for just a sec in terms of what worms are best suited for this idea of vermiculture. And that's going to be our red wigglers, Icenia fetida. And so when we look at these red wigglers and you're purchasing these particular worms, it is always nice to look at the genus and species as I've identified up here. And if you are ordering them online or you're in a home and garden center and you're asking them for worms that you can use in vermiculture, red wiggler is our common name, but it's always nice to add that genus and species as well to ensure that you're getting the correct worm so that you have the best success in your vermiculture bin. So a few reasons in terms of why do we use this particular red wiggler for our vermiculture bin. And the first is that they are surface dwellers. So when we think about surface dwellers, they live in that upper layer of the rich organic matter in decaying litter piles. So when we compare them to something like an earthworm, so our earthworms are burrowing individuals, our red wigglers lack that component. So they're really only staying up in that upper portion, as I mentioned, those layers. And so they're not found deep within that subsoil. So that makes it a great combination for them to continue to eat and break down that organic matter that we've added to this vermiculture bin, and then to create that nice compost that we like to use. If we think about the anatomy of our red wigglers, they do have a crop and they do have a gizzard. So some of us may be familiar with this idea of crop and gizzard if we, raise chickens in our backyard. But essentially we're saying that our red wigglers have no teeth. They're using the gizzard to grind up those food sources and mix that with a little bit of grit as it moves through that gizzard. And so that's kind of keeping in mind in terms of why we aren't able to eat those entire seeds so that they won't germinate, as we use them later on or use that compost later on. In terms of, growing your vermiculture bin, so you'll start with a number of worms, and then these worms will continue to rapidly mature. If our environmental conditions are, ideal for this particular individual species of the red wigglers, we could double our population in about 60 days. Our red wigglers are going to mature and be at sexual maturity in about 30 to 45 days. From the time that they hatch, so after hatching. So a pretty quick turnaround in terms of life cycle and reproduction and doubling our earthworms that could be in our vermiculture bin. These worms are hermaphroditic, so when we look at these worms, they do have both sexes, but they must mate with another worm to reproduce. So they're essentially gonna lie head to tail, and they're gonna transfer that sperm as they lie head to tail. So much like what you have probably experienced with earthworms outside in your yard on a cool morning when you see those two worms that are up reaching each other and essentially exchanging that sperm and egg component. So during this process, we end up with an egg case that kind of falls off of that worm. But when we have an egg case that's ready in the pile, in the compost, you'll see a few of them here on this slide, and I've got them circled there for you. So you definitely probably saw the one at the top of the picture, but they are kind of lemon-shaped, yellow in color, yellowish brown, I guess I should say. And each egg case could hatch up to 5 worms in about 3 to 9 weeks. So as those worms mature in that case, when they do pop out of that case, our red wigglers as young worms are kind of whitish to pink in color, and they're about a 1/4 inch long and about the diameter of a thread size. So pretty small in terms of when they first start to hatch out of that egg case in that vermiculture bin. So may or may not be easy to see depending on our eyesight or maybe what magnifying options we have in our particular area. And the other is that they are photophobic. So photophobic essentially means that they're sensitive to light. So they have this fear of light. And so when we think about these red wigglers, we have to use this photophobic idea as we create our bins and creating what that bin will look like, as we'll talk about next. But they don't like that idea of light. In fact, they'll be eating there, and as you pull that material, that bedding back, they'll start to scatter and move back into that material down below so that they don't have to see that light. It also helps us as we kind of transition to harvesting our compost later on. But oftentimes we get the idea, where can we purchase them? There are commercial worm growers that you can purchase these red wigglers from online. There are also local garden centers that will oftentimes carry these red wigglers. I know I've seen in my area in the Treasure Valley, there are 1 or 2 garden centers, local garden centers that do carry those in the store. And so that's a nice location to do that. Or if by chance you know of a fellow, perhaps master gardener or a fellow individual that's in your area or neighborhood that's also doing some vermiculture and vermicomposting, as they harvest, they may be ready to downsize maybe their population of worms and might be willing to give you some of their worms to start your vermiculture bin as well. But overall, there are 7 types of worms that are used for vermicomposting in North America, worldwide, 7 species that have been identified. But really, this is the one that works the best for our scenario and our location in terms of doing vermiculture in the bin. So here are some options as we get started. And as Colette mentioned, this Bulletin 982 Vermicomposting at Home through our Idaho Green Thumbs for the University of Idaho Extension has some of these steps to go through. So as you look at this presentation today, don't feel like you need to write down inscribe everything down. You can find these kind of nice steps in that bulletin as well. But when we first think about this bin, there's the idea of the pre-made or build. So this particular picture here kind of outlines some of the visuals for what we would find within a pre-made. So this is the bin that we have in our office. So a few things that I'll kind of point out here. We've got this location on the bottom, which is going to house some of our leachate that has drained from our composted area. And then the next few layers here, we can see that we've got an area where we've got some another section and layer there. Then we're going to have our next layer as we continue on, and then we've got our lid that sits on top. So when we build these particular bins, if we want a stackable layer, we need to kind of keep this idea in mind of what this one looks like, and we'll look at some other pictures as we go as well. So location. So a few things we need to think about in terms of location. Our red wigglers like temperatures in the range of 55 degrees Fahrenheit to 77 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's their like ideal range, right? Each individual person likes a particular temperature in their house, but these red wigglers would prefer that 55 to 77 degrees. They will tolerate temperatures down to 40 degrees and up to 90 degrees, but as we move beyond that 55 to 77 range, it's really not as comfortable for that particular red wiggler in your bin. So if we're thinking about a location in the house, in your area, where can I do that? Under the kitchen sink, depending on the size of bin that you've created, works really well. A utility room, if you want it kind of out of sight, works really well. Or even if you have an insulated garage that will kind of stick within, those temperature ranges, that 55 to 77 works well as an addition to that. So if you kind of think about your location, think about your temperature as well. So if we look at our area in terms of outdoors, we could put them outdoors, but you do need to be sure that you think about that temperature range, that 55 to 77. So you could transfer these in and out as temperatures change. I personally think that it's just easiest to keep them indoors in that one location, whether it's that utility room, garage, or under the sink. But if you are going to end up placing them outdoors, think about these ideas in terms of protecting them from extreme temperatures. So perhaps the north side of the structure would be preferred versus the south side of the structure. And then we want to be able to reduce temperature fluctuations is the main idea here. So we're trying to choose an area that maybe will maintain relatively stable temperatures if we're going to place those outside. And then if you are placing a bin outside, we do need to think of some type of structure to help repel any rain. So in this particular case, we wouldn't want rain to drip down through the top of our bin. In our bins that we're going to show here in a bit on how to create those, you wouldn't want that rain to drip onto that lid and then get into your worm bin as well. So something to repel that rain and secure against rodents. Perhaps you have raccoons in your area, but we would want to make sure that that lid is somehow attached, or you've got something around it that's not going to allow those rodents to get in there. So those would be things to think about if you're going to move those outside. So let's think about size. We saw that pre-made bin. Here's a nice container size that works well for some of our vermiculture bins. And so if you start to look at your size here, first think about the location where you're going to place that and how much space do you have there. How much food waste you might have that you produce in a week. So this is a general rule as we kind of think about how much space do I need for how much waste and how many worms. So 1 cubic foot of space would be good for 1 pound of food waste and 1 pound of worms. So 1 cubic foot of space, 1 pound of food space, and 1 pound of worms. That's a nice general idea in terms of looking at that tote size. And so how many cubic feet are you going to have? So a 14-gallon tote is about 2 cubic feet in volume. And so other things to kind of think about in terms of size is your height. So we don't need a lot of depth here within our layers, because remember our red wigglers are surface dwellers, so they're going to be in that top few inches of material that we're going to place inside that bin. So you'll notice the bin height on this one is about 7 1/8, I think, in terms of looking at this particular bin. That's a nice size because, generally we wouldn't want to have any more material than 8 inches above those particular worms. And then you've got your width and your length. And so those are the areas that you could adjust those bin sizes for the location that you might place that. Containers that are over a foot in depth are not recommended. So, if you have a container that is a foot over, maybe it won't be the best in terms of stacking and creating this layer. But if you're purchasing new bins, do try and stick to bins that are less than a foot in depth. So keeping also right in mind that these red wigglers are going to dwell towards that surface. As we think about style, there are many options that we can choose from. So you could create a worm bin from lumber. I personally think it's just nice to use a plastic bin, especially if you're going to be housing that inside. We don't have to worry about any leaching that might occur between our layers of wood material. But if you are going to use a wood material, do make sure that there are no toxins in that wood. So this would essentially mean that we don't want to use any pressure treated woods to use in this bin construction. And you do not want to paint the inside of the bin. So as you kind of create that, do not paint, stain, or lacquer the inside of your bin as you create that wood structure. The other things to keep in mind, though, as you select bin sizes, whether it's plastic or you create something with wood material, is that we want the material to be opaque, and we also need a lid on top of that. So we don't want light to be able to shine through that. So clear totes are not great bin style to select when we get to that particular material. And if you are going to create a stacking bin, it's always nice to purchase those bins at the same time. So while you may not need that additional set as you first create this bin, it is nice to have that on hand so that you know that your bins will always stack easily and nicely as you go. So when we start to get to the idea of creating the bins, also think about if you want a single layer or if you want to create this stacking bin type as you create your own vermiculture bin. So let's dig a little bit deeper in terms of creating the bin construction. So if you are truly going to create your own bin versus purchase one that's pre-made, which I think it's a really nice, afternoon activity to do to create this bin. These are the things that we want to consider. So first, we need to have some airflow. So on the side of our bin, just below the lip, as you can kind of see here, we're going to add a 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch holes. And that's going to be about a dozen around that particular tote or bin structure that you're using. So you've got those that are sitting around the outside of that particular bin. The other piece that you could look at is using a 1-inch hole with a commercial vent. And so if you look at this little vent up here that we've placed in the lid, this is just a 1-inch soffit vent. So you'll kind of find those in the area where you've got some roofing generally in your not garden centers, but I'm losing the words, like a Home Depot or a Lowe's and so forth. So when you're looking at kind of those hardware stores, you'll be able to find those in kind of the roofing section is generally where they're located. And they're kind of this soffit vent, circular soffit vents. So those are nice things to use as well if you don't like the holes and you would prefer to have something that looks like it's been preset into there. This would be another option. And so if you're using this 1-inch vent here, it's nice to have those around the outside. And so I would recommend 4. And so as we look at this particular picture, we've got the 4 vents that are placed into this bin. And so those are 1-inch holes, and we just use a 1-inch hole saw, and then these vents pop right into that location. Do note that the top of your bin does need, it is nice to have a little bit of airflow up there as well. So if you're using that vent, this 1-inch vent works. If you're drilling some holes, just go ahead and add some holes there around the top of that lid. So drainage and movement has to be considered as we think about our worms. are breathing through that skin. And so we don't want them to be sitting in a bunch of leachate or water materials that have been at the bottom of that bin. So it's nice to have a bin on the bottom that is going to be solid. So in this case, the picture on the left here, this blue bin is a solid bin. There are no holes in the bottom. So this is where our leachate is going to build up. And so when we look at this purple bin, if we flip it over, we've used some 1/4-inch holes in the bottom to select a bit smaller versus the 1/2-inch size. And we've placed about 20 of them in the bottom of this bin. One thing to keep in mind as you drill these holes is you're going to want to drill them on the area that would be the lowest in the bin, as it's normally flipped and would be with the worms inside. So to try and reduce, right, as much water and leachate from sitting in that top bin versus if I were to drill holes in this location here or in this area here, those are going to be higher on the other side of the bin. And so kind of keep that in mind as you're creating this bin construction. So about 20 holes. And our bottom bin is going to hold the leachate. And so that's the piece that we think about in terms of stacking. So right now we definitely know if we're going to create this stacking bin or just one bin in general to allow leachate to drain, we need at least 2 totes or 2 bins that are the same. So when we start to look at your bins and you want to create stacking, you want at least 3. So we would need to purchase at least 3 of the same bins at that time, or if you have some that fit together at home already. So in the bottom, you could add a drain plug. So on the left, we've got the picture of a drain plug. It could be pretty simple drain plug situation like this. You could get something a little bit fancier if you prefer that, will allow you to turn on and off that drain. And that was what you see here in this pre-made bin in the top right picture. And then you can just leave that bottom bin entirely solid, which allows you to not have to worry about anything leaking, from that connection that you would put in there. The downside to leaving a solid bin with no drain is that you've got to pull that bin off and you'll have to be able to drain out, so tip over this bin and leachate. So, sometimes individuals might not feel comfortable or not be able to lift this particular bin with that water that's in there, so a couple inches of water in the bottom, so they prefer to have the plug. And when we're thinking about this leachate, the leachate is all kind of the material of water components that are released as these worms are composting in this bin. So we need a place for them to kind of, that water to build up. And leachate also kind of, if we're looking perhaps at adding like cantaloupe into our bin, our melons are really high in water content. And so that water is generally going to move somewhere and we want it to move to the bottom. And so that's kind of a general idea in terms of what we think in terms of leachate sitting at the bottom. The other piece I want to note here is that if you look in this bin on the right, we do have 2 bricks that are essentially sitting in here. This could be, some bricks that you already have. It could be some 2-inch PVC material. It could be a 2x4. But the idea here is that we do want about 2 inches of material that will sit at the bottom of that bin so that those bins are not sitting, layer to layer. We want a good 2 inches here to allow that material, the leachate, to build up as it drains off of those totes up above. So we've kind of created that bin component, and the next piece that we're gonna kind of move into is gonna be the bedding. But I think before we go into bedding, I'll kind of pause and see if there are any questions in terms of constructing a vermiculture bin at this point.
Thanks, Nick. We do have a couple questions that came in. I think one that you probably already covered was what is leachate? And I just think talking about that leachate, is there a recommendation about how often you drain that off?
Yeah, so it will vary a little bit in terms of how often, if you're feeding a lot of really moist components like melons. But here at the office, I generally only drain that leachate off when I end up harvesting a layer of compost. And so as I'm harvesting that layer, I've pulled that bin out and I can see how much leachate is in there. but about every time you harvest your compost. And we'll get to how quickly that would be, but you could make some compost in as quickly as a month, depending on how many worms and how much you're feeding them.
Okay, thank you. And then another question is, can you keep the bin itself in a small office refrigerator for maintaining that 55 to 77 degree temperature?
Yeah, I would say if you're in an office location, I would just keep that outside of the refrigerator, because actually your refrigerator should be at temperatures below 40 degrees if we think about food preservation and safety. So that actual fridge is probably going to be a little bit too cool to keep inside. But perhaps if it's sitting on top of that fridge, that would be an area, or simply just in an office. Perhaps it's under someone's desk, or under, if there's a sink in that particular office, under that sink. But I would not place those worms into the fridge itself, but to keep them exterior in that office location.
Thank you, Nick. And then just as you move through your harvest conversation, we have a question about the liquid itself, and then would you add that to the outside compost pile, or how would you use that liquid?
Yeah, you can add that to your outdoor compost pile if you would like. And as we get to kind of the end of the harvesting compost and the leachate, we'll talk about how to mix that leachate so that you can use that essentially as a liquid fertilizer component as well. So I think I may save that until I get to that location in the presentation, if that's okay.
Yes, that is great. Those are all of the questions that have come in so far. Thank you.
Perfect. Yes, so we've created this tote and bin scenario that we have. So whether you have created your own or you're using a pre-made, the next step is to use your bedding. So when we think about bedding, the main thing that we have to consider is that we want it to be non-toxic and a fluffy material. And so general things that work really nice are newspaper or office paper, paper bags work, cardboard can work. It's just a little bit thicker and may take those worms a touch longer to break down. And you could also use like a coconut core would work as well. Although I find that the first few, the newspaper, the office paper, paper bags, and cardboard do work a little bit better. That core could potentially have some compaction problems, but it is one that is listed as a potential option. The main thing to remember is that we can't use any glossy paper. So unfortunately, those magazines that we get that have that nice glossiness to them, we can't use in this bedding material. So as you think about shredding these, fortunately in our office, we have a paper shredder. And so individuals, I just pull out that paper that's been shredded, and it's shredded in the strips. If you have something that's maybe shredded with the crosscut, I would caution maybe using crosscut 100% in that bin, because it could also maybe not create as much fluffy material as we need, or open airiness, whereas those strips would work as well. If you're using newspaper, if you're ripping with the grain of that paper, just cut that paper into about 1/2 inch, or rip that paper in about 1/2 inch shreds. That will work. It can be smaller, but 1/2 inch works pretty easily to kind of rip down that newspaper. And then the main thing about this material is that it's going to hold moisture and allow airflow. So I've already mentioned the fluffy material, allowing that airflow, but it also is going to hold some moisture for us. So we've got our material in terms of the newspaper, the office paper, our paper bags that we've ripped up, or our cardboard that we've ripped up, and we're going to need to soak this bedding material. So we're going to probably soak that bedding material for 5 to 10 minutes. This can be in a bucket, could be in a sink that you have in your area. For me, myself, I just use the office sink here. I go ahead and add my material, add my water. I go away for 5 or 10 minutes and then come back, and I pull out that material. And when I pull it out, I'm gonna wring out the water. So I'm not gonna leave all of that water in that particular paper product that I'm using, but I'm gonna wring it out so it feels kind of like a moist sponge. So about that dampness of that moist sponge. And so then you've wrung it out, so you've kind of squished it all together. So you are going to need to fluff that material back up as you put it into your bin. And when we put this into our bin, we want that material to be about 4 to 6 inches in depth. So, as you're putting this dry material in, you might notice like, oh, I've got about 4 to 6 inches. And as you add that into the water and you wring that out, it is going to decrease a little bit. So I'd probably recommend starting with about 8 inches of dry material as a good starting point to get to that 4 to 6 inches of material once you get to that final bin component. So we've soaked that material, we've fluffed it up, we have about 4 to 6 inches. This is our beginning piece that's going to be in that bottom of that tote. So like you can see here, we've got our 4 to 6 inches ready. We've got a secondary tote underneath that's going to be holding that leachate or allowing that to collect that. So now we're moving to the part of how do I introduce worms to the bin? So it is ready. How do I introduce worms? I'm going to present 3 methods to you that you can use for introducing the worms. All 3 methods are as equally as successful and work equally as well. It's just a matter of personal preference when you get to these methods and what maybe you have time for and when you purchased your worms. So method 1. So the first thing we're going to do is we have our bedding. So you'll notice all of these, we start with that 4 to 6 inches of bedding, and then we're going to use either compost, crushed eggshells, or coffee grounds, some used coffee grounds. And remember, we said that those red wigglers are going to be using that gizzard and absorbing some of, or eating some of the crunchier material in there to kind of break down these products. And so this is where this compost, this crushed eggshell, or coffee grounds will work. And it's not a lot, just a fine, a little scatter across the top of your bin. And so once you've got that compost or crushed eggshells, finely crushed eggshells or coffee grounds, you're going to add your worms, and you're going to allow those worms time to settle. So you'll notice we're not adding food scraps at this particular time. So we're going to add worms on top of that bedding material. So we're actually going to let them decide how far they want to go into that bedding material and to get away from that light source or be deep as they would prefer. So we're going to allow them time to settle, and in about 3 to 4 days, we're going to pull back 1 or 2 inches of that bedding material, and then we're going to add our food scraps. And then we're going to cover that food scrap back up with 1 or 2 inches. Anytime you're maintaining a bin, we always want to make sure to have 1 or 2 inches of bedding material on top of the food scraps that we're placing in the bin. So our food scraps should never sit at the top of the bin. There should always be some bedding material over top. That's method 1. Method 2, same process with the bedding. We're going to take about 2 inches back as we started with our 4 to 6. We're going to pull about 2 inches back. We're going to add some food scraps on top of the bedding that's sitting in there. And then we're going to place that bedding back on top of those food scraps. And we're going to allow some time for this material to break down or decompose. So about 3 to 4 days for it to kind of break down and decompose. And then once those 3 to 4 days have passed, we're going to just add our worms on top and allow that worm or worms to go to the layer that they would prefer. And they're going to find their food scraps just under that top 1 to 2 inches of bedding that we've left. For method 2, you could also add some compost, crushed eggshells, or coffee grounds into that bedding material as you're prepping that or have that prepped. Method 3, so we're going to add our bedding. We're going to pull back 2 inches again. We're going to add our food scraps. We're going to cover those food scraps with that 1 to 2 inches that we pulled off. And then we're going to add our worms on top all on the same day, all at the same time. And so essentially we've got our worms, we created our bin, and we're set to go. So we just do that all at once. So those 3 methods will all work and they will be successful no matter which method you try. A lot of times it's just a personal preference and maybe what time you have available to wait to transfer those worms. So that's kind of our way that we prepare the beds. What do we put into that food layer as we kind of talked about putting things in there? Do feed the things that are on the left-hand side here, our fruits, our vegetables, coffee grounds are good, tea bags work. You can feed bread materials in small amounts. I personally don't put any bread material into my bin here at the office because it does have a tendency to maybe potentially get a little bit slimy if your moisture gets a little bit high in your bin. But you can use bread in small amounts, and that includes cereals and pastas. Don't feed meats, poultry, and fish, your oils, your dairy products. So those are pretty typical of compost areas. And the other thing that is different from our traditional compost pile is these highly acidic citrus or onion components. So we don't want to feed any oranges or even the rind of those oranges or any onions into this compost pile. So those are acidic components and a little too acidic for our worms in that environment. And then don't add any manures of any sort to your vermicomposting bin. You wouldn't want to create a stinky bin, and it's not good for our worms. So how to feed. So there are a few things in terms of how to feed once you kind of set up that bin and look at your methods of feeding. The first thing to kind of consider is the smaller you chop your pieces, the quicker that piece becomes consumed. And mostly, right, if we think about surface area that's available for those worms to munch on one small piece versus one large chunk of an apple or half an apple, there's more surface area for those worms to do more work in a small piece versus a large piece that they can attach to. So your smaller pieces, as you chop them, you get a quicker compost breakdown, just like you would in your traditional pile outside. There are a few ways to feed. One of them is called pocket feeding. This is the process where you're going to pull back some of that bedding material, essentially kind of making a hole. So maybe you start in a corner and you have your 4 corners and you've got a couple spots in the center, but you've created these pockets. So, maybe at the end of the evening, you've got some material. I go to pocket number 1. I pull back 1 or 2 inches of bedding. I place my material into that pocket, cover that pocket back up with my 1 or 2 inches of bedding that I pulled back. And so that's going to allow this idea of pocket feeding around that bin. And so you're going to make sure to cover that entire bin as you pocket feed. And generally individuals come up with kind of a method of movement around their bin. The next one is surface feeding. So surface feeding says that you're just going to, maybe you're collecting your materials for the week. And so you've collected them at the end of the week, you're going to surface feed, you're going to spread those materials on top of the current bedding that sits there. And then you're going to add some more fluffed bedding, 1 to 2 inches of fluffed bedding on top of that material, that surface that you just fed. So that's called surface feeding. The next piece is how frequently do I need to feed? There's no real hard rule about feeding. We try and use the general rule that 1 pound of worms will eat their weight in a week. So a pound of scraps is a pound of worms. That doesn't always hold true. Your worms might be a little bit hungrier at times. They may not be quite as hungry at times. But try and feed them their volume per week. That's where I would start. So if you bought a pint of worms, go ahead and feed a pint of worms or a pint of food scraps per week. But observation really is the key as you start to begin. So when you get to this beginning piece of how often do I need to feed, just kind of observe them, see if they've eaten everything before you add some more. Or if you start to notice you're getting a big buildup of food scraps, you can go ahead and continue to collect those food scraps and place them into the freezer for use later on when you need to feed those worms again. Moisture. So as you continue to add that bedding or monitor these worms, that bedding should always stay moist. And so if it does dry out, just go ahead and spray those with a little mist of water. So if you have a little hand sprayer, that works really well. I do not recommend using like a bucket of water or a faucet with some water on top of those because you're going to get too much water. But just a nice little mister will work great if it does dry out. If you get too moist, I would just recommend maybe popping the lid just a little bit to allow a little bit more airflow. Or you could put some dry material, bedding material on top, and that will kind of soak up some of the moistures as well. So those would be my 2 recommendations should you experience something with a little too much moisture. And do note, you could run into moisture conditions being too high if you're feeding a lot of melons and we don't have airflow and air movement. So then we get to the idea of harvesting this compost. So there are a few methods of harvesting compost. There's sideways separation, vertical separation, and light separation. So when we get to material that looks like this and we no longer have any food source that's in there, like you see in the top right, which is some apples that are remaining. But when you get material that looks like this, you might have a few flecks of bedding that's left over, but now we're ready to harvest. And so when you use the idea of sideways separation, we're going to feed only on one side of the bin. So we're going to specifically pocket feed or only surface feed on one side. The idea is that we're trying to get the worms to only be on the one side. On the opposite side, we're going to remove our vermicompost from that side, and then we're going to replace with fresh bedding and food. So as you kind of are sifting out that vermicompost, you might look for egg capsules. You could look for some worms that are still on that side and put those back into your bin. Because if you're placing this compost outside into your landscape, those worms are not going to live and survive in our area, in our general area around Idaho in terms of our temperatures being outside of their range, their preferred range. So once we remove that compost, we're going to refresh that bedding just in those methods that we talked about earlier. Refresh your food, and then you're only going to feed on that side that you've just redone, or you've pulled out that vermicompost and created that new bedding. So you're going to feed on that side only. That's going to encourage our worms to move to that other side, and then we're going to pull the compost from that other component, the opposite of where we're feeding. And now we've got a nice fresh bed as we kind of look at what's happening. I would allow about a week or a week to several weeks for worms to kind of move over. You can look and see if there's no more food on that side. Most likely they have migrated to the other side of that bin. So this is sideways separation. Then we go to vertical separation. I kind of like the idea of vertical separation, mostly because that's what I have here in the office for the bins, but it allows me to get those worms to move up into this next layer for feeding. And I know that I can feed in that layer for several weeks or a month. And then I know that all of the worms have come out from the layer below. So I personally prefer this particular method in terms of separation. But if this is not an option for you, one of the other two options will work. So you're preparing that additional stackable bin. So here's our bottom bin here, holding the leachate. This is our bin that's ready. And we know that it's ready because this bin, this gray bin up top, fits snugly against the material that's in the bin below. So this is going to encourage, remember, we have holes in the bottom of this gray bin. So our worms are able to move up through that. And we're going to create bedding and feed in this upper bin. And then once we've gone through at least 2 weeks, and you could even go longer than that, but once you know that those worms are up in this top bin, then you can go ahead and pull that bin off, take this middle bin now out, and you can harvest the compost in there. Again, you could look for those worm capsules, egg capsules, and put those in the main bin so that you can have additional worms that will hatch in time. And so that's this idea of vertical separation. So as you kind of see here over on the right, that's our first layer, the leachate underneath. And so then I have this layer that's currently ready, but right now I'm feeding in this layer. So as I continue to feed in this layer, and once I feel like most of those worms have moved up, I'll go ahead and pull out this layer. And then once this top layer fills, I use this layer to just place on top of that or that level. And then we have light separation. This works really well as well in terms of if you don't maybe have time or you want this compost now and can't wait for them to separate to one side or add that next layer. So first thing we need to have is kind of somewhere to place this material onto, whether it's a tarp, an old shower curtain, but definitely not going to want to do this on your kitchen table, but have some type of barrier that you can do that on. We also need strong light. Indoor light works, outside light in the sunlight will work as well, because we're going to use to our benefit the photophobic component of these worms so that we can harvest the compost around the outside. So I've dumped out my compost onto my layer of tarp, and I'm going to pile them into some little hills or mounds, kind of volcano-like. And then I'm going to wait about 5 minutes for those worms to kind of move inward. And then I'm going to scrape off a layer. So these two piles were about the same on my first layer. And then I scraped off a layer, and then I got to about this size when I started to see some additional worms. And so I waited another 5 minutes, and then I continued on down, and now I have a bit smaller pile. So you just repeat this process until you've gone to the smallest pile you can that you want to continue to harvest that. And so you'll end up with this little cluster of worms that are ready to be placed back into a new bin. The best part about this light separation is while you're waiting these 5 minutes, there are times that you can do that bin prep as you go. So you kind of move through that process, create your new bin, come back, pull off some compost, work on that other bin and have that ready. So your fresh bedding and food is ready, and then you return the worms to your bin. So that's the idea of light separation. And I would say it probably takes about 30 minutes to an hour, depending on how quickly you want to move through that process of light separation. But in the end, I had this little pile of worms under one of my volcanoes as I harvested that compost, and I put these worms back into that fresh bedding. So we'll kind of run through troubleshooting, and then we'll take some time for some additional questions. But as you kind of look at the troubleshooting components, I'm going to hit a few highlights, but this was adapted from Worms Can Recycle Your Garbage from North Carolina State Extension publication. And so as you start to look at these solutions, this list is adapted from that particular publication. So your bin smells bad. Oftentimes it's because of overfeeding. Remember, we have no set rule in terms of feeding, but we just kind of have to monitor those. We can use the one they eat as much as you have worms. So if you had 1 pound of worms, 1 pound of food, or 1 pint of worms, 1 pint of food. If you place some non-compostables in there, those do get stinky. So that's why we have that list of things that you should not put in there. And then the bin attracts flies. So if you have trouble with flies, go ahead and make sure that your food scraps are not exposed to air. If you still have trouble with maybe some fruit flies, I would recommend placing that material that you want to feed to your worms into the freezer first, and then place it into your vermiculture bin. That seems to help individuals who maybe have trouble with fruit flies. So if that's a problem within your particular bin. And maybe you have some rotten food in there, or you've overfed your worms, and so they can't quite get through that. And then your worms are dying. So generally worms are either going to die because the bin is too wet, or the bin is too dry, or you've exceeded their temperature range that they prefer. So when that bin is too wet, mix in some dry bedding, leave the lid off, or leave it askew so that additional air can move through. If it's too dry, just go ahead and do that misting as we mentioned earlier. And then you've got the other temperature components that are listed there for possible causes or solution. If worms are crawling away, so if they are escaping out of your bin, something is wrong. So you'll need to go back up through these other lists and kind of evaluate, is my bin too wet? Because your worms are not going to want to leave the darkness to go somewhere else. So if they are escaping, something's wrong with the bin. And so kind of take a look at some of these other troubleshooting options as well. So if mold is forming, we could be too acidic or the bin is too wet. So just add some more material on top of that. I know here in the office, we have a period of time where we feed a lot of coffee grounds and it gets a little wet, and sometimes we get a little extra growth up top. So we have to remember to place in some dry bedding so that we can absorb some of that moisture. And if you've got liquid collecting in the bottom, so I really recommend having a bin underneath that collects the leachate, but if you're only using a solid bin, you do really have to be careful in terms of how much moisture you're putting into that bin. And so this one right here talks about that particular process. So I'm going to pause here and I'll put in my quick plug for the Pacific Northwest Pest Alert Network, as maybe Colette gets ready for some questions. But if you do have a landscape and garden area and you want more information on insects, disease, or pests, or cultural reminders of what to do in your landscape, go to pnwpestalert.net and go ahead and sign up for those landscape alerts. I think it's a really useful tool as well. So.
All right. Thank you, Nick. Thank you for that amazing presentation and all those detailed steps and the troubleshooting charts. Just a reminder to everyone, all of Nick's slides are going to be available on the Cultivating Success website. We do have a couple of questions that have come in. One is talking about the bedding in particular. And so Mindy asks, does she need to worry about the toxins from printer inks?
Yeah, Mindy, I haven't seen anything in terms of worrying about our printer inks. I know the newspapers in our particular area are using a non-toxic ink in the Treasure Valley, when I say our area. So we don't have to worry about any of those newspapers. And I would venture a guess that most newspapers are using a non-toxic ink, and I haven't run into any issues in our office using any of our paper that also has ink on it as well.
Great, thank you. Another question is about the material in the bed, and Joel asks, how often should I turn the material?
Yeah, so the great thing about a vermiculture bin is that unlike the traditional compost pile outside, we don't actually have to turn any of the material. We're just continuing to add uh, your scraps into that bin. So if you're doing the pocket feeding, you're just lifting back some of that bedding, putting some of the material under there, your food scraps in there, and then placing that bedding back on top. So there's really no turning, I guess I should say, of the bin. So you don't have to worry about turning that material over. It's just a matter of continuing to make sure that you have that paper bedding product in that bin so that those worms can eat that product, paper product, and the scraps that you've been placing in that bin. So no turning needed for the vermiculture bin.
Great, thank you. You talked about adding the eggshells when you're setting up your bed. Can you add eggshells throughout that composting process or the life of your worm bin?
You could certainly add eggshells to that bin. Do keep in mind that if you're adding those eggshells, you'll have to really crush them up and place them in that bin. So they're going to have a difficult time navigating and eating through that actual solid shell or even a cracked shell. But if you are going to place those into the bin, go ahead and crumble those up really good. If you start to notice that you're getting a lot of eggshell material, so if you're an individual who maybe eats a lot of eggs, for during the week, you'll probably overload your worms with that eggshell material. And so you may have to stop feeding those crumbled eggshells into that bin.
Thank you. And then we have a question that's specific to Moscow Pullman. So Christine's asking about local sources for red wigglers. And I know you mentioned checking with your garden supply companies locally. And I did put into the chat, perhaps contacting the local extension educator to see if there's any master gardeners who would be raising red wigglers. Are there any specific other sources that you would think about locally?
Yeah, I can't think of any other local sources. Like you mentioned, the Lawn and Garden Center is where I would go for my local source, or if you wanted to search those out online. But yeah, contact your local extension. They may have a master gardener program who has individuals who are willing to give you some red wigglers. I know we have a list here when we get to that point of donating worms to individuals. So
Yeah, and that's a really good point, Nick. We do have a number of local Facebook groups like Food Not Lawns and Palouse Homesteaders. And it's been my experience in the past that as those red wigglers multiply, oftentimes people are looking for a new home for some of their worms. So the final question that I have for you is, when we're out composting in our garden per se, and we're going to spread that compost, at the beginning of the season, often, going down just a little ways, we find a cluster of small worms that look like red wigglers. Is that a red wiggler, or do you know, and would you recommend anybody actually trying to use those worms for vermicomposting?
yeah, I don't specifically know if they would be a red wiggler. I'm gonna guess that they're not, just based upon the temperatures that we might experience in Idaho. I guess we could have some warm pockets, so it is potential that maybe they would be. But my guess is that they are not a red wiggler. But if you do find some of those, I would take those maybe to your local extension office and see if by chance they would be able to help you identify what particular worm that might be. But I'm going to venture a guess that they're not a red wiggler.
Great, thank you. And we have one additional question that came in. I think it's a great question, so let's take some time for it. How quickly do the worms reproduce? And does the population grow in a way that we would need to remove some occasionally?
Yes. So those worms in about 60 days. So if conditions are ideal, we could double our population in about 60 days, so 2 months. And so if your bin gets a little bit too full, so keep in mind the 1 cubic foot of space for 1 pound of food for 1 pound of worms. So if you have a cubic foot of space and you've got over a pound of worms, it's time to kind of either share some of those worms with someone else or start another vermiculture bin where you can take your own worms and start bin number 2. And so I guess about 60 days is when they're going to multiply and double in numbers in terms of growing. And then it's just a matter of kind of maybe weighing those or taking a look at what did I originally start with? What was that amount? And what do I have now? And what's my space in my bin?
Thank you. I want to thank you for this great presentation today and thank everybody who's participated. We would love your feedback, so please take a moment to take the post-webinar evaluation. It should link when it should actually pop up in your browser when you exit the webinar today. You'll also receive a link tomorrow in a thank you email that is also going to provide you a link to the webinar slide handout, the recording, and the publication that Nick referred to. Just what's coming up next. So next week we have Soil and Water Week, where we are actually having 3 presentations, one focusing on irrigation, another on soil testing for the vegetable garden, and then water-wise landscaping. The remainder of our March webinar theme is going to be looking at pest management and pollinators. So again, please visit cultivatingsuccess.org to register for any of these upcoming events. Again, Nick, thank you so much for your presentation today. We appreciate your time and expertise. Just so very well done. And again, thank you everyone for participating, and we look forward to having you on a Cultivating Success webinar in the future.